Welcome back here with Goldberg. Today I wanted to talk about something that you might come across if you're interacting with a libertarian or an Occupy Wall Street type Bernie Booty boy. And they'll go, "In America, we have corporatism." Now, if they just left it at that, it would be sort of understandable. They don't comprehend the term, they're just appropriating it, whatever. But then they'll add on this and they say, "And that's how it was in Mussolini under fascism." Which, look, I appreciated. Back when I was part of the Ron Paul movement, I probably had the same outlook. In my defense, of course, this was a time period when the internet.com only had like 2 megabytes of storage. You didn't have good resources available. Now I have, at my own expense, acquired a number of very good titles. So I will, of course, be writing the book to give you guys a better idea. But it's just pure ignorance. It's based upon the fact the American public education system doesn't require people to read in detail what started World War II, what these ideologies represented, and everyone just seems intent on trying to create a crude caricature of their opponents. So if you can associate them more with some murderous dictatorship, that means that you are winning the day, even if you're totally ignorant of the subject matter. But when we talk about corporatism, or in Italian, corporativismo, the corporate state, it was theorized and implemented in part in Italy, and then of course you had the version in the Estado Novo in Portugal, which many people don't even know existed. It's not where you're looking at stuff like, okay, Goldman Sachs, corporations run society. This is based on a misunderstanding of what corporation refers to. In the context of Italy, this goes back many years. In fact, it may have even originated in the Roman period, but the collegio, the corporation, was similar to a guild, not exactly the same, essentially a political and economic association that was used to devolve certain powers and administer or organize society. No, it's not just a corporation trying to seek profit and screw over the populace. That is really a total misperception based upon the fact that, again, no one really has interest in the granular aspects of these various systems. So when the fascists were coming to power, you have to recognize, first of all, that fascism was a catch-all movement. It was an amalgamation of socialist, syndicalist, nationalist, certain right-wing interests. They were based upon how they looked at the flaws of the existing social and political systems. So Mussolini himself saw the late 1700s and most of the 19th century, he called it the century of liberalism, where there was this claim through the rising liberal and radical movements that as long as we hashed things out, we had liberal democracy, property rights, individual expression, we could implement reforms, we could make things better within the confines of that system, and people would just go along and get along. Your party doesn't win, you accept the result, and you sit it out until the next election, and then you make your case again. But as they viewed everything, liberalism was responsible for the Great War, which cost millions of lives, was truly horrible, World War I. In the defense of liberalism, I do want to say, of course, you had a lot of these decadent European monarchs still in power and these tottering empires. I think that was a bigger factor, but nonetheless, many people thought that liberalism had failed. And in the view of the fascists in particular, the issue with the liberal state was that, first of all, the state kind of faded in the background. But more importantly, certain interests would dominate and, frankly, undermine the well-being of others. So think about it for a second. You have an election and the Conservative Party comes into power. Well, they cut taxes, roll back regulations, and maybe they decide that working conditions can be less safe for the worker. So that's now in the interest of the guy who owns the industry, but it's hurting the working conditions of the person who's employed. Now the socialists come into power and they say we're going to nationalize the industry. Well, you kind of turn tables. If you're a socialist, you're in a better position, but if you are the head of the private industry, you're screwed. So the fascists wanted a model in which they could take all those various interests, unite them, and put them towards what they saw as the ultimate objectives of the state. In the case of Mussolini's advisors with corporatism, that meant organizing society into a bunch of different corporations or stakeholders. No, again, this does not mean that you're going to have Goldman Sachs and Amazon and Google running the whole show, but rather a corporation served as an amalgamation of specific interests from a part of society. So you might have a corporation for the fruit industry, a corporation for textile workers, trade unionists, a corporation for doctors or scientists, and they'd get together and they'd essentially come out with solutions, how the country could move forward with a common interest in mind. Particularly when it related to labor and the employer, they did outlaw strikes, but at the same time they wanted to ensure that there was a very clear-cut communication between people who were running the factories or the companies and their employees, and strictly enforced labor contracts so you wouldn't have the abuse of employees. And you say, well, what's the point of a system like that? Well, just think about it for a second. Under more of a liberal model like ours, where essentially the government does more or less what big industries, multinationals want, under an Italian system, the state might say, well, we want Italians to have high wages and decent benefits. And the company says, I lamau, but it's cheaper for me to import Somalians. Well, the government would step in and say, no, that's not going to happen because that undermines national interest, that undermines the well-being of our people on the lower income rungs of society. That is the difference fundamentally. Now, Mussolini claimed to respect private property rights, and you were certainly better off with private property in Italy than you would have been in Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany didn't entirely adopt the corporate model. They had a much more of a almost revolutionary socialist approach. Not that they completely eliminated private industry, but their attitudes towards private property were quite interesting, and I'll be doing a separate video on that subject, but I just wanted to make that note. And the other thing that Mussolini made very clear is he said the corporate state includes regulation, and regulation means control of the economy. And this is different from what you might have in our existing system, where the regulations that people tout, like Dodd-Frank, are jokes because they're written by members of the industry and they're usually implemented by cronies of the industry. And so they end up being fangless, toothless, and not of much value. That's the fundamental difference. Politicians in our system might say, well, this is good for the economy, but it's usually good for their big political donors. It's not necessarily in the interests of workers. And you see that with these bailouts. They benefit overwhelmingly Wall Street and big industry, and they kind of leave the workers on the wayside. You try to implement minor reforms on behalf of workers, and you usually get swamped with complaints from the larger industry players. So I just wanted to set that up as a contrast. It does not necessarily mean that the corporatist system was successful. It doesn't mean it didn't have flaws. But it's not accurate to describe fascist corporatism as similar to what we have today, where I would describe it, I said, a late-stage oligarchy, maybe a spiraling, degenerate liberal state, but it is not accurate to put the label of corporatism and link it to Mussolini with the great morass that we're experiencing in the United States. So, no question changes should occur, and we should examine different approaches and ideas, but certainly the problem with our system is that there has been decades of no reform, and if you go through those long periods and you fail to make necessary changes, that's when people drift towards some of these more dangerous ideologies because they just give up hope and they have no faith in the liberal state.